It began not with anger or rebellion, but with routine, with the soft tyranny of schedules printed on thin paper and pinned to a corkboard, with the quiet obedience of showing up on time, tying an apron, clocking in, and stepping under lights that never slept, lights that flattened hours into sameness and made every evening feel interchangeable. And in that sameness, I learned how easy it is to stop noticing yourself, how easy it is to believe that your presence is temporary and therefore disposable, that your time is elastic and can be stretched a little further whenever someone else needs it. And I did stretch, again and again, because stretching felt like professionalism and patience felt like maturity. And there was something almost tender in the way I believed that if I gave enough of myself, the system would eventually respond with fairness, that it would see the extra effort, the delayed exits, the customers helped after closing announcements echoed through the store. And I told myself stories to make the exhaustion softer, stories about balance and long-term justice and invisible credits accumulating somewhere in my favor. But those stories were lies I told myself to survive, because the truth was harder to face. The truth was that every time the clock rounded my labor down, every time 7 minutes vanished and 10 minutes dissolved into policy language, a small part of me was being trained to accept less than I deserved. And training is dangerous because it doesn't hurt at first. It feels normal. It feels like adulthood, like compromise. And the real violence of it was not the money lost, but the normalization of loss itself. The way my coworkers and I laughed it off, joked about staying late, shrugged when the clock shaved our hours. Because laughter is often the final defense before resignation. And love, in its quietest form, lived there too. Not romantic love, but the love of being useful, the love of being needed, the love of believing you matter because you are dependable. And I carried that love with me through late nights and aching legs, through missed buses and colder dinners, until one evening when the store finally emptied and the doors locked and the silence felt heavier than usual, like the building itself was holding its breath, and something inside me refused to exhale. And I went home not to rest, but to count, to trace my own existence through timestamps and receipts and schedules, to prove to myself that what I felt was real, because systems thrive on making pain feel imaginary. And as I added numbers that represented fragments of my life, a shape emerged, sharp and undeniable, a shape made of unpaid minutes stacked into hours, hours stacked into days. And suddenly I could see the theft not as an accident, but as a design, subtle enough to be deniable, consistent enough to be profitable. And that realization broke my trust in a way that felt almost intimate, like discovering that someone you loved had been lying, not loudly, but habitually, casually, without malice, which somehow hurt more. And anger arrived late, but when it did, it was clean and focused, stripped of theatrics, because anger born of clarity doesn't scream, it steadies. And I began to speak, first carefully, then firmly, explaining not just numbers, but principles, explaining that time is not abstract, that minutes are lived, breathed, endured, and that laws exist not to inconvenience employers, but to protect human boundaries. And the resistance I met was predictable, wrapped in politeness and procedural language, but politeness is often the mask injustice wears to seem reasonable. And still I persisted, not because I was fearless, but because fear had already taken too much from me. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the machinery shifted, policies rewrote themselves, clocks stopped rounding, and the change felt anticlimactic at first, like justice often does, because justice doesn't announce itself with applause, it arrives as correction, as alignment, as the quiet relief of knowing that when you leave, you are truly done. And the real transformation didn't happen in policy documents, but in people, in the way coworkers stood a little taller, in the way conversations changed tone, in the way stories poured out once permission to notice had been granted. Stories of missed childcare pickups, of aching backs, of minutes that added up to months of disrespect. And I understood then that this fight had never been mine alone, that it had been waiting for someone to name it. Because naming is powerful. Naming turns discomfort into demand. And as talk of back pay surfaced, it felt less like compensation and more like acknowledgement, an admission that what had been taken was real, that our labor had weight. And beyond that, a deeper hunger emerged, a hunger not just for corrected paychecks, but for protection, for solidarity, for a structure that didn't rely on individual courage to fix systemic harm. And that is where love returned, stronger and clearer, the love of collective dignity, the love of standing beside others not as competitors for shifts, but as allies for fairness. And unionization stopped sounding like a threat and started sounding like a promise that no one would have to sit alone at a kitchen table proving their own worth ever again. And looking back, I see that the story was never about clocks or rounding or even money. It was about reclaiming the right to be fully human within systems designed for efficiency, about refusing to let quiet compliance erase lived experience, and about understanding that resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, sometimes it simply says with unshakable calm that time given must be time honored. And that realization changed not just policies, but people, including me. Because once you stop accepting stolen minutes, you stop accepting pieces of yourself, and that is where real freedom begins. And as that freedom began to take shape, it didn't arrive all at once, but unfolded slowly, like learning to breathe differently after years of holding your breath. Because once you realize that your time has value, you begin to see how many other parts of yourself you've been discounting to survive. How often you have said yes when you meant no. How often you have stayed quiet to avoid being labeled difficult. And this awareness was both empowering and painful, because empowerment always asks you to mourn what you tolerated before you knew better. And I mourned the version of myself who believed exhaustion was proof of worth, who thought loyalty meant silence, who confused patience with acceptance. And as weeks passed under the new policy, the change became visible not just in pay stubs but in posture, in conversations, in the subtle way people began to leave on time without guilt, began to say, "I'll finish this tomorrow," without apology. And these small acts felt radical because the system had trained us to believe that boundaries were selfish. And love, real love, the kind that is not transactional, re-emerged here too. In the way coworkers reminded each other to clock out, in the way someone would say, "Go, you've done enough today," and mean it. And the workplace slowly transformed from a space of quiet depletion into one of cautious solidarity. And with that solidarity came memory, because once people feel safe, they remember. And they remembered years of shaved minutes, remembered moments when staying late meant missing family dinners or last buses home, remembered how often management's convenience had been prioritized over their humanity. And these memories did not surface as chaos, but as testimony, shared in break rooms and after shifts, stories layered over stories until a collective narrative formed, one that could no longer be dismissed as isolated misunderstanding. And when talk of back pay grew more serious, it carried emotional weight far heavier than the checks themselves, because back pay symbolized recognition, an institutional admission that what had been taken was wrong. And recognition matters because it restores reality. It tells workers that their experience was not imagined, not exaggerated, not important. And that restoration of reality created momentum, the kind that doesn't need shouting to move forward. And unionization, once whispered like a forbidden word, became a topic of open discussion, not because people suddenly became radical, but because they became realistic, because they understood that systems rarely protect individuals by default, and that protection must be structured, collective, durable. And fear was, of course, because fear is the shadow of change, fear of retaliation, fear of instability, fear of being labeled troublemakers. But fear no longer owned the room the way it once had, because knowledge weakens fear, and shared knowledge dismantles it. And through meetings and conversations and late-night reflections, I came to understand that what we were building was not opposition, but balance, not chaos, but accountability. And the love at the heart of it all was not loud or sentimental, but steadfast, the love of fairness, the love of refusing to let another person feel as alone as I once did at that kitchen table, counting stolen minutes. And as this awareness spread, it reached beyond the store, beyond the shifts, even beyond the immediate fight. Because once you recognize exploitation in one place, you begin to see its patterns everywhere. In how society glorifies overwork, in how it praises sacrifice without questioning who benefits from it, in how it romanticizes burnout as ambition. And I realized that this story, though rooted in one workplace, was part of something larger, a quiet global struggle between efficiency and humanity, between profit and dignity, and the most dangerous myth of all, that people should be grateful simply to have work regardless of its cost.
And rejecting that myth felt like reclaiming a language we had forgotten to speak, the language of worth. And the longer this journey continued, the clearer it became that resistance does not require extraordinary people. It requires ordinary people who stop doubting their perceptions, who trust the evidence of their own exhaustion, who believe that fairness is not a luxury but a baseline. And as union cards were discussed and strategies planned, there was no illusion that the road ahead would be easy, but there was confidence. And confidence changes how you walk into a room, how you hold eye contact, how you speak your needs without shrinking. And sometimes late at night I would think about how close this all came to never happening, how easily I could have ignored the discomfort, how easily the minutes could have continued disappearing unnoticed. And that thought humbled me, because change so often depends on moments that feel small at the time, moments of